Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the Atlantic Commission. Dear friends, we are living in turbulent times. There are unseen divisions between Europe and the United States, and especially the Trump administration. From trade to Iran, and from Israel to climate. And there's also a rise of autocratic leadership and populism in Europe, which is threatening the cohesion of the European Union. Many people fear even the end of the West and our rules-based world order. NATO is not excluded from those tensions. Last year, President Trump called NATO obsolete, and his support for NATO and for Article 5 seems lukewarm. And more than any US president before, he criticizes the European allies for not doing enough to beef up their defense expenditures. Last week, the NATO Secretary General, Stoltenberg, uniquely warned that the transatlantic relationship is at risk. And he also said that there is no certainty that it will survive. I haven't heard such alarming words by a NATO chief in the past 25 years. Against this background, NATO leaders will meet for a summit in Brussels in July. Today we will have a close look at their agenda and at the state of the alliance and its leadership. Will burden sharing dominate the summit and the final communique? Will we see more European commitments and more transatlantic unity? Last week, a NATO official told me he hoped that the NATO communique would not end up like the G7 communique, torn apart by the US president aboard Air Force One. And of course, another question, will there be tweets? Or an incident like last year, when the US president pushed aside the Prime Minister of Montenegro. We have a great lineup for you to discuss all these questions today. We will start with a keynote speech by the Dutch ambassador to NATO, Marjanne de Kwaasteniet. She will focus on the Dutch contribution to the summit and to NATO. Our second speaker is NATO veteran Jamie Shea, Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges. He will tell us more on the goals of this summit from a NATO perspective, and it's a special day for him because this is his last visit to the Netherlands as NATO official. After the coffee break, we will continue with American and European views on burden sharing and leadership by NATO. We will listen to Ken Gardner, he's a political military officer at the US Embassy in The Hague, and to Roland Freudenstein, the Deputy Director of the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies in Brussels. And after lunch, we will continue with a keynote by American geopolitical analyst John Hulsman, who will address the political schisms within and between the US and Europe. And we will wrap up the day with a panel with all speakers. And of course, during the day, I would like you, as an audience, to join me in firing all your nasty questions at our speakers.
The NATO-Russia Council remains our main channel of communication, and I can personally testify that our last meeting on the 31st of May was useful. During that meeting, we exchanged information on upcoming exercises. From NATO's side, we spoke about the exercise Trident Juncture, which will be held in Norway in October and November. 40,000 participants, 130 aircraft and 60 vessels from 30 countries will participate. It is the biggest exercise held in the recent history of NATO. And therefore we attached much importance to provide information about this exercise during the NATO-Russia Council.
The great challenge for NATO, and I think for the first time in all of the 38 years that I've been working for the alliance, is not to handle one big problem in one particular geographical area at one time. You think, the Fulda Gap, the Cold War, the Balkans, Afghanistan, more recently Libya, where we could focus all of our diplomatic and military efforts over a period of years on one particular challenge. But today we have to be active on 3 strategic fronts at once. They've been mentioned, the East, the South, and the domestic front, hybrid, because we're now in a world where the centre of strategic gravity is going from land and borders to the minds of our own population, their sense of what to believe in, what is credibility, the authority of government, the perception even that they have of reality in a world in which anybody can attack anything from anywhere at any time. Never before has that existed, before the invention of the man-made domain of cyberspace, and everything is contested. Whether it be land, sea, space, cyberspace, we are in a phase of permanent competition. This summit is an attempt at a rebalancing of the alliance, for bringing in more fundamentally, for the first time, the southern dimension in a more equal way, and the hybrid dimension. And I think that is going to be, for me at least, the sort of yardstick whereby we measure the success. Now, certainly when it comes to the East, that was mentioned already. Yes, there will be another package of important measures. After the initial assurance measures that we took after 2014, the limited exercises, many involving less than 1,500 NATO forces, the rotation of forces in and out to demonstrate NATO's presence and solidarity, the initial planning of fledgling graduated response plans, and eventually, of course, the forward presence of the 4 battalions and the tailored presence in the Black Sea, Romania, Bulgaria area. We've got critical mass. In the south, a bit here, a bit there, a bit there. Is that really going to change anything very fundamentally? Should we be helping the states that are still relatively democratic and coherent? Should we be trying to stop the conflicts? Do we start in the Maghreb rather than the Middle East? Should we focus overwhelmingly on Iraq and Afghanistan and leave the rest to the EU? There are big strategic issues here. We still don't have sufficient coordination between NATO and the EU with our respective efforts, or even between NATO and what individual allies are doing. So how in the next year can we turn the package for the South into a true strategy for the South? How do we bring in the UK? Today something wonderful is happening in Paris, which I totally salute. The Netherlands is part of it. The European Intervention Initiative is being inaugurated today by President Macron and the French, with 9 initial participants, including Germany. Late in the day, the Germans have joined, but the UK is in this, notwithstanding Brexit. So, in other words, how can we involve a European defence with the NATO EU countries together, even outside the 2 formal institutions which can contribute to it? And finally, what can NATO do with its defence planning, its training, its exercises, also to promote this greater European role? How can all these things fit together in a way which presents a convincing picture to the US over a long term that the 70% dependency on them today will be down, say, to 30% in critical enablers and capabilities by the year 2030. This would be good for NATO, and if the Europeans were ever on their own, which I don't think would happen, and I desperately hope it would never happen, but if the Europeans were on their own, they'd be much better able then to deal with that situation, having done European defence than others.
So one of the other first things that happened when I got here is your former Minister of Defense, Ms. Hennis, gave a speech about, at that time I think she called it a military Schengen, and she was talking about it down, I think it might have been Rotterdam or Eindhoven, I can't remember the exact location. And I wrote this, what I thought was this great cable, and I sent it to US NATO, and I sent it back to the States, and I talked about this military Schengen, and the response I got was, what are you talking about? And for 6 months, I repeated that message, it didn't get a lot of traction. Well, the last 6 months, I can tell you, is completely the opposite. This is one of our biggest priorities for this NATO summit. And the reason why it's one of our biggest priorities is because most of the other things we're trying to do can't happen unless we do this. And the Netherlands, God bless you guys, have been the biggest advocates for a military mobility inside of Europe. And not only that, but also the ones trying to break down those barriers that were there from a lot of different angles right at the beginning of this, including U.S. Skepticism on it. We were very concerned this was going down an EU path and that NATO would be kind of on the outside of it. But the Dutch have made sure that every time we start talking about military mobility, whether it's under PESCO or what's under NATO, everybody understands that those things have to be the same. They don't work if they're not the same. And recently, when there was issues with trying to get that language correct, the Dutch have been very good about trying to make sure everybody came together. So on military mobility, we see that as a key to everything that we're trying to do, whether it's under PESCO or whether it's under NATO. So, and we appreciate that very much.
I'm skeptical because I'm afraid that the rule that where you stand depends on where you sit in Europe. In other words, your geographic location determines, for once I'm an adherent of geopolitics here, where you are located determines largely your attitudes on what the biggest threats are, what the proper response to those threats are, and so on.
What is NATO? What are we doing? What is the alliance? What is the West? And look at the politics, not the policy. The politics are why you're all here, being wrong. The policy we broadly do very well on, and as has been said, get on and make it work. But if the politics go so wrong, at what point does that infect policy, as you were asking this morning? Is there an inflection point? Obviously there is somewhere, but where is it? So let's look at what's wrong, and then maybe we can make it right. As Bram challenged us to a dinner last night, what can we say positively about this? There are two quotes that are going to inform my Banquo's Ghost tour of how bad things are, but I promise it will end in a more happy note. The first quote is "What's Wrong?" from Professor Owen Carr, and this describes why the US and Europe are at each other's throats. Few things are more corrosive in politics than the conviction that you have been wronged so much that you're justified in breaking all the rules to get even. Meet the 2%. Transactionally, he's the most transactional man alive. Meet it. Then you can say, okay, now here's what I want. He will understand that. He will not be offended by that. That is utterly reasonable for you to ask and ask if you meet the number. Meet the number. Explain to him again why NATO matters. Life insurance in Europe is a really good idea after the last 100 years. I mean, this isn't, have Mattis in the room over and over again explaining this. He'll get it with the 2%. He'll buy that you're valuable. Second, let's do something valuable. Talk him out of a tariff war over automotives. It's automotives that matter because it gets at Merkel in Germany. I live in Bavaria. I have an office in Bavaria. They're scared out of their minds. That's what he's going after. He wants to make Merkel squirm. And it would work.
I think the rules-based global order is under attack on more fronts than it was in 2003. In 2003, it was basically the UN system. It was about, a ultimately unilateral decision to invade militarily, and the Allies actively trying to undermine the effort. You remember there was a long military buildup of half a year or so. And in that process, even making alliances with Russia at the time, it was Schröder, Chirac, and Putin. So there were some parallels, but I think that if you take the whole trade thing, this was absent in 2003. Today it combines also with actually a turn away from the West, or what we Europeans perceive as a US turn away from the West, also in documents like the National Defense Strategy, National Security Strategy, which seem to argue for some kind of, free-for-all, everyone for themselves kind of international arena in which every nation tries to get the best. These are all elements that we didn't have in 2003. This is one difference. The other one is, as I said before, at that time, the East-West split in Europe was slowly closing. During the year 2003 and following, that gap closed despite Chirac's valiant effort to keep it alive and to enhance it. Today, I'm afraid we've got it opening up. We ain't seen nothing yet in terms of Europeans, especially in Central Europe, willingly getting picked off from the pack for bilateral deals, and this may start in security, and it may go elsewhere. It may go to economics and trade. So I think in a couple of points we are in a more dangerous situation, but it's not unsolvable. It's certainly not unaddressable. And there I'm completely with my two fellow panelists here that we need to do something. and spending spending is one thing, defense spending, but the other thing is a kind of strategic culture where I think we have to actively work towards. Venus has to pick up arms too once in a while, and it's true that the French can do it, and they're willing to do it to a certain extent.
It would require Europe becoming a hard power instead of staying a soft power.
To an extent, we cannot remain the purely soft power that we are. To the other extent, we need to mutually recognize each other's strengths and weaknesses.
A NATO seminar being dominated by other topics like migration, trade, because this is the era of 2018. I won't summarize everything, don't worry, but I would like to mention a few things, positive and slightly negative of this day. The glass is half full. In the dark side of town, the Dutch ambassador said, "We're doing more, but not enough." Jamie said, NATO is modernizing. But look at this summit, it won't be judged on what it did, but what it permitted for the future. I think that's very important to remember. What Ken Gardner said, don't look at the rhetoric all the time, but look at the relationship. And I'm still wondering if the Netherlands are on those list of 10 countries or not. I think they are. And I think there is a list in Washington, I'm pretty sure.
I'll go check.
Roland said, and I share this shame, that he is ashamed for Europe and ashamed for Germany. I fully agree. John eloquently introduced himself as an Eisenhower left-wing Republican.
I'm it.
Sorry?
I'm the only one, so stuff me.
Yeah, okay.
I'm still wondering what that is.
And clashing worldviews between Jacksonians and Wilsonians. But the conclusion is that NATO will survive Trump, and that NATO will even get stronger financially. Because, as Keith Richards said, darling, this is bigger than the both of us.
That's a great quote.
That was a great quote. And so the overall conclusion is that we are leaving this room perhaps as optimists. But we all know the definition of an optimist. No, the definition of an optimist is that he is a well-informed pessimist. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention, and please join me in applauding for our great speakers. See you next time.